Well, appreciate each of you being out tonight. Thank you for making the effort to be in God's house tonight. I know it's a blessing to your pastor to see you here, and I'm sure the Lord is pleased as well with your effort to be in God's house. Kind of reminds me of the snowstorm out in Wyoming. It was a terrible storm, and the pastor, he thought, well, surely no one's going to come to church tonight. It's just too bad out there. The roads are closed, but he said, I think I better go over to the church and at least be there just in case, in case somebody is able to wander in, I better be there. And so he made his way very treacherously to the church and opened it up. And sure enough, one old rancher showed up. And the pastor was pleased, that he had made that effort. And the old rancher sat down in the back, and the pastor, well, he just went on with the service. And he led some singing and had prayer and preached the message and preached his heart out and preached about an hour. And when it was over, he stood in the back. The rancher came by, shook his hand, and said, Pastor, that was quite a message. He said, I wasn't expecting you to preach quite an hour. And the pastor said, well, he said, when your cows, he said, if only one comes up to eat, you still feed them, right? He goes, yeah, but I don't give them the whole load. And so we'll see tonight whether we get the whole load or just a part of it. But thanks for being here, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 6, if you will. The book of Isaiah and chapter number 6. Isaiah writes here of a vision that he sees of heaven. And in this passage, I believe there are some great truths for us tonight. Isaiah chapter 6, and beginning with verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the doors moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. There will be seasons in your life where you'll wonder, where's God? You ever been there? You ever felt like God was absent? You ever felt like God maybe vacated his throne for a while? That somehow as you prayed, there just wasn't any kind of connection? It just seemed like your prayers were in vain, unheard, unanswered. There are seasons in our life where we will feel like God is missing. When I was a freshman in college, I met a young lady toward the end of that freshman year, and we kind of met on accident and began a friendship. Nothing real serious, but we continued that friendship through my sophomore year, my junior year. And she was a year and a half ahead of me, and so middle of my junior year, she was finishing college and had already signed a contract to go teach in a Christian school here in Indiana. And as I said, we had become good friends. We had, I suppose, as people had looked at it from the outside, they would have said we were dating. We didn't talk about getting married or anything like that, but we had become good friends. Neither of us wanted to think about marriage until we finished college, and so that wasn't a topic of discussion really in our friendship. But as we got toward that middle of my junior year, it seemed obvious to us that we weren't meant for each other. I mean, she was an education major. She was ready to graduate. She was already contracted to go teach, and she was very excited about that and looking forward to that. And I still had a year and a half of college left, and God was calling me to preach and into evangelism, and it just seemed like those two things would never really merge together in some feasible way. And it just seemed like, though we enjoyed being around each other and we had developed a good friendship, that it just wasn't meant for us to go any further in this relationship. And so one day after lunch, we had a talk, and we decided to end our relationship. And I went to an afternoon speech class, and it was an upper level class, and I knew everybody in the class. We always had a good time in that class. And yet that day, I chose a seat over by the windows, away from everybody else, because I couldn't stop crying. Now, I'm not a crier, but that day I couldn't stop crying. All of a sudden, something was missing in my life. All of a sudden, there was this hole kind of in my heart, and I didn't really understand what was happening. And I remember sitting in that class thinking, God, where are you? It was 1975. I was scheduled to hold 3 revival meetings, a week long each, in the city of Los Angeles. I had never been to California before, much less Los Angeles. I was living in the Midwest at the time, got in my car. I had a Volkswagen Beetle, and got in that car and began to drive to California. No interstate highway, just a 2-lane road, 55 miles an hour. No air conditioning. Now, I remember driving and driving and driving and driving, and I thought, my geography teachers have lied to me. There is no Pacific Ocean. I thought, there is no place called California. I've been lied to. I drove and finally crossed into the state of California and into Los Angeles. Now, we didn't have GPS in those days. For you kids that are here, we didn't have GPS. We had maps. Now, a map is a piece of paper with lines on it, and the lines represent the roads. And I was trying to follow that map to the first church there in La Puente, California, right in the heart of Los Angeles. And about Saturday morning, about 10 o'clock, I pulled into the church, and I was just so excited to be somewhere. And I pulled into that parking lot, and there was a man kind of working on some flower beds, sprucing up some things around the church. And I got out, and I walked over to him and introduced myself, and he introduced himself as the pastor. And after we introduced ourselves, he said, what can I do for you? I said, well, I'm here to hold a revival meeting. He said, I don't know anything about that. I said, oh, thanks. Got back in my car. And I remember driving out of that parking lot and onto that street in front of the church and drove about 10, 12 blocks. And I came to an old hotel. Pulled in, went inside. Nice lady behind the counter asked if she could help me, and I said, well, I think I'm going to need to talk to the manager. She picked up a phone, and pretty soon this gentleman appeared. He said, what can I do for you? I said, well, I'm going to be here in this town for the next 6 days, and I need a place to stay. He said, no problem. I said, well, there's a little bit of a problem. I only have $36. I didn't have a credit card. There was no such thing as credit cards. I didn't have a debit card. No such thing as debit cards. I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have anything but $36. He kind of looked at me, and after a bit, he reached under the counter and he pulled out a ring of keys. And he said, follow me. He led me out a back door of that hotel office into a courtyard area. It was really just kind of an in-between area between some buildings, all grown up with grass, and some old beds and dressers of drawers stacked up, just kind of a junk area. And we walked down a little path across that courtyard to an iron door, and he took one of those keys and opened it up, pushed it back. And here was a room with a tile floor. It was probably about 12 by 12. Had a military cot in one corner with a mattress. There was a shower, there was a sink, there was a commode, and there was a metal folding chair. He said, "It's all yours, $6 a night." I gave him my $36. And he went out the door. When he closed the door, I saw something out of my left peripheral, and I looked, and above the door there was a little shelf. And on that shelf was a small black and white television set. Now, I remember thinking to myself, well, at least I have a TV. And I walked over to that television set, and I clicked it on, and it was showing snow. Black screen, white lines going across. And I thought, I don't want to watch snow. I'm from the Midwest. I've seen snow. I'm in California. I turned it to the next channel, but every channel was showing the same program, static. I remember sitting on the edge of that bed thinking, God, where are you? It was 1982. We had scheduled a revival in Warrenville, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. Pastor's name was Ralph Boersma. Pastor Boersma was one of the kindest, most gracious men I ever have known in my life. He was a church planter, and he would usually go to a town for 3 years and establish a church, get it going, and then he would call a pastor, and he would move on to another church. And I had preached for him in 2 other locations where he had started these churches, and I had come for revival meetings. And he was now in Warrenville and starting this church, and he asked us to come. And I was traveling with my family now. I had a wife and 2 little children, and we were pulling a trailer, and we were traveling that way across the country. And we got there to Warrenville and pulled into his driveway. He lived in a 3-story house there in that old town, and he had 7 children. And we parked our trailer there in the driveway of his house. We started the meetings. But the meetings didn't go well. It was like Murphy's Law. If it could go wrong, it went wrong. We were renting an elementary school building. The janitor would never show up on time. We had to break in the building just to have the meetings. And everything just seemed to go wrong. We couldn't get anybody to come. We couldn't get visitors to come. It just wasn't going well. And I remember about Wednesday, I said to my wife, I said, Pastor's really discouraged. And I know his family's discouraged. And I said, I don't know what the love offering will be this week. It probably won't be much, but I just feel like whatever it is, we should give it to the pastor and his family. I think he needs it more than we do. And she said, well, I've been kind of thinking the same thing. I said, well, let's pray about it. And so we prayed for the next 2 days, and Friday night came, and nothing had really improved. And Friday night after the service, they invited us inside to play some games with the kids and eat some popcorn. And afterwards, he reached in his pocket, and he pulled out an envelope and began to say, I wish it could be more, and we did our best, and I hope this will meet your needs. And for the first time in my life, before or since, I opened that envelope in the pastor's presence, and I pulled out that check. So I was going to sign the back and give it back to him. When I pulled that check out of the envelope, I couldn't believe the amount. $250. Now, in 1982, $250 was a lot of money. And it was an amazing amount of money for a week of revival meetings. I had no idea where they got that kind of money. But I already knew what I was going to do, and I turned it over, I signed it, and I said, Pastor, I believe the Lord would have us give this back to you. He tried to resist, but I stuffed it in his pocket, and he began to cry, and his wife started crying, the kids all started crying. I got out of there. No sense hanging around that stuff. You know, we went to bed that night. When you obey the Lord, you feel good about it. And we slept like a rock. And got up the next morning and hooked up our 16,000-pound trailer to our truck, and we were headed to St. James, Minnesota. And I had my fuel tanks full, and And we pulled out of Chicago and up through Wisconsin and across on I-90, and we got to La Crosse, Wisconsin. And both of my fuel tanks were on empty. And still had 100 miles to go. And I said to myself, God, I need gas. And the Lord said, well, get some. I said, well, that's easy for you to say, but I don't have any money. I still didn't have a credit card or a debit card or anything like that. I'd given all my money to the pastor in Chicago. The Lord said, get gas. I said, Lord, I don't have any money to get gas. He said, you have money. Now, I had heard of preachers pulling into gas stations and filling their car with gas and somebody else paid for it, but I didn't have that kind of faith. I was operating on a cash basis. The Lord said, you've got money. I said, no, I don't. He said, yes, you do. And I remembered in the trailer, we had bought this bucket, this little pail with some shovels and stuff that the kids were using to play in the sand and stuff. Well, the handle had broken, but the kids liked the bucket because it was a fluorescent yellow and they wanted to keep it. So we washed it up and we were putting our pennies in that bucket. Now, we weren't saving them for anything. It was just kind of fun. Every time we'd get some pennies, the kids would throw them in that bucket. It was about 3/4 full, and the Lord said, use that. I pulled off the interstate into a gas station in La Crosse and bought 40 gallons of fuel with pennies. I'll never forget the expression on the attendant's face as he counted them 2 by 2 on that glass counter. Nor will I forget the expression of the 7 people standing behind me waiting to pay for their gas. But God miraculously got us to St. James, Minnesota. Little clapboard building on the edge of town near the fairgrounds. The pastor was working 50 hours a week at a lumber yard to make ends meet. Just 35 people in the church, the youngest of which was 65 years old. We had the morning services, and no one said anything about lunch, so we went out to the trailer. We had a few cans of goods and put that together, and I thought they'll feed us tonight. And Sunday night service came. We preached that, and when it was over, the pastor said, well, I got to get up at 4 a.m. to go to work, so I'll see you tomorrow night at 7. We went to bed hungry. The next morning, I was out behind my trailer getting ready to wash everything down. I always like to wash my rig down on Monday morning, get all the road grime off of it. I was having a pity party. I said, God, I know I did what you told me to do in Chicago. I know it was the right thing to do. And you miraculously got us here. But Lord, where are you now? I mean, I can fast this week. I don't need to eat. I got a wife and 2 kids in there, and if I don't take care of them, I've denied the faith. I'm worse than an infidel. God, where are you? There will be seasons in your life where you'll wonder, where's God? May I remind you, your Savior's been there? From the cross, he cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I believe Isaiah's there in Isaiah chapter 6. The king has died. The nation is without leadership. The nation is vulnerable to attack. And Isaiah the prophet is calling out to God, Lord, what do we do? What's my role here? How am I to lead these people? God, where are you? We need direction. We need help. God. And I believe in kind of a subliminal way in this text, Isaiah reveals 3 locations where we can always find God. Now, you and I know that we have a promise in this book that he will never leave us nor forsake us. But we, as the song says, are prone to wander. We are prone as sheep to go astray. And oftentimes when we get away from the Lord, we wonder, God, where are you? God, I need a prayer answered. God, I need you to work. I need a miracle. I need something to happen. Lord, where are you? And Isaiah reveals 3 locations that we can always retrace our steps to and find God. First, God is always in the holy place. As Isaiah gets this vision of the throne room of God, he sees these seraphims, these angelic beings. They have 6 wings. With twain they covered their face. With twain they covered their feet. And with twain they did fly. And one of these angelic beings, he cried, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The word holy is a qualifier for every attribute of God. We say God is a God of love. He is, but it's a holy love. God is a God of wrath, but his wrath is a holy wrath. God is a God of justice, but his justice is a holy justice. Everything that God is qualified by the word holy. The Bible tells us in Leviticus chapter 11 and verse number 45, the Bible says, Lo, I am the Lord that bringeth thee out of the land of Egypt. Be ye therefore holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The psalmist prayed in Psalm 99 and verse 9 that to worship toward thy holy hill, for the Lord our God is holy. John the Revelator in Revelation 15 and verse 4, he said, Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like unto thee, glorious in holiness? Now we have to remind ourselves that holiness and unholiness cannot coexist. Righteousness and unrighteousness cannot get along. And so when we find ourselves away from God, when we feel like God is absent, when God is vacant from our life, we've got to get back to the holy place. We've got to come back to that place of holiness. Having therefore these promises, Paul told the church at Corinth, cleanse yourselves of all filthiness of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the sight of the Lord. I enjoyed the special a moment ago, didn't you? You know what? I have a hunch they practiced that. They didn't just decide when they walked in the room tonight, hey, let's sing. What should we sing? Oh, let's do this one. God's good. No, they planned that. They were contacted, hey, would you sing? And they thought about that. And they prepared a song and they practiced it. Why? Because they were going to try to be a blessing to us. They tried to perfect their voices together to sing for us. Someone who plays the piano doesn't just sit down and start playing. They practice, they work at it. They try to get better and better. A person who plays sports, they have to go out there and practice and work at playing that game. How hard do we work at perfecting holiness? What did we do today to perfect our walk with the Lord in holiness as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to your former lusts and your ignorance, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it's written, be ye holy, for I am holy. Now, I know people say, well, Brother Goetsch, it's 2025. People don't live like they did back in the Bible. Come on. We live in the age of grace. It's interesting. Titus chapter 2 and verse 11 talks about the grace of God that saves us. And it's only by God's grace that we're saved. But it talks about that in Titus 2 and verse 11, the grace of God that saves us. And then in verse 12, he says, teaching us. In other words, this grace that saves us, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, godly in this present world. And you know, it doesn't matter if you're reading that in the 1st century or the 21st century, it's still this present world. And while the world changes, the world goes farther and farther from God, God wants us to get back to the holy place. Hebrews 12 and verse 14 says, follow peace and holiness, without which no man can see the Lord. God's going to seem distant. God's going to seem absent. God's going to seem vacant from your life when we're not following peace and holiness, because without them, we cannot see the Lord. God is always in the holy place. But notice, secondly, he's always in the humble place. As Isaiah gets this view of the throne of God, and he hears this expression of the seraphim, holy, 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 his response is, woe is me, I'm undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. The response was one of contrition. The response was one of humility. Isaiah 66 and verse 2 in part says, to this man will I look. Now, I don't know about you, but I need God to look my way. I need God to bless my life. I need God to favor my life. I can't do what God has given me to do unless he helps me, because without him, I can do nothing. So I need God to help me. I need God's favor. And he says, to this man will I look, even to him that is of a poor and a contrite spirit, and that trembleth at my word. You see, God doesn't hang around his abominations. These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him, a proud look. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination unto the Lord. Though the Lord be high, Psalm 138:6 says. I guess so. He's as high as you can go. We saw that Sunday morning, didn't we? He's above all. Though the Lord be high, yet hath he respect unto the lowly. But the proud he knoweth afar off. You know, if I were to ask you, who do you respect? Well, I suppose it would depend on the context of the conversation. If we were talking about music, let's say, someone who plays the piano, if you said, who do you respect in that world of pianists or those who are musically inclined, they would probably look to somebody that's better than they are, someone that has taken lessons longer or has perfected their skills in a greater way. And they would say, boy, if I could play like that, if I could play half like that, I'd be happy. I look up to them. In the sports world, a high school player looks up to a college player looks up to a professional player, a business person. They look up to a business that's already established and creating a service for people and helping folks through that business. And they would say, boy, that's the model. That's where I want to get. And we look up with respect. Well, who does God respect? Though the Lord be high, yet hath he respect unto the lowly, the humble place. God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. A man's pride shall bring him low, but honor shall uphold the humble in spirit. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. When I was a boy growing up, going to church, I would often hear preachers talk about an evangelist named Paul Levine. I'd never seen a picture of him. I'd never heard him preach. I really didn't know much about Paul Levine other than these preachers would talk about this evangelist and his ministry. And I remember as a boy thinking, well, boy, I hope somewhere along my lifeline I meet this guy, Paul Levine. I've sure heard a lot about him. Paul Levine was saved at the age of 4. He was called to preach at the age of 4. As Pastor said a moment ago, don't underestimate what God is doing in the hearts and lives of children. Paul Levine was saved, called to preach at age 4. His mother said after he was called to preach, he would come home after church on Sunday nights. He'd grab his little New Testament, he'd jump up on the piano bench, and he would act like he was preaching. Paul Levine finished high school at age 15. Never went to college. At 15, he became a full-time evangelist. Began traveling all over the Midwest, Iowa, where he was from, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin. Couldn't drive a car. Had to hitchhike, take public transportation. But Paul Levine began to travel as a 15-year-old evangelist. By the time he was 17, he had a singer that traveled with him. His name was Bob Finley. Bob Finley was completely blind. And these two men would travel, play their mandolins, sing, and Paul would preach. And God was blessing their revivals all over the upper Midwest. In fact, if you go to a state like Iowa or Minnesota or Wisconsin, where I lived for many years, and you say the name Paul Levine, you'll have somebody say, I got saved under Paul Levine. Paul Levine had a radio program 6 days a week out of Waterloo, Iowa, called Bible Echoes. Preached the gospel every day. He had a tract ministry called Bible Tracts Incorporated. It's still in existence today. Bible Tracts has printed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tracts in multiple languages. I was in a Flying J truck stop not long ago, went in to use the restroom, opened the door, 2 tracts fell on the ground. One in Spanish, one in English, both published by Bible Tracts Incorporated. An amazing man. I'd never met him, never heard him preach. In 1981, I was preaching a revival in Danville, Illinois. One day a knock came on the trailer door, and it was the church secretary. She said, Brother Goetsch, you have a phone call. We didn't have cell phones yet, and so people would call you at the church where you were preaching. And I ran in the church office and said hello. A voice on the other end of that phone said, Brother Goetsch, this is Dr. Bill Rice III at the Bill Rice Ranch in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He said, we've never met. But he said, I've heard about your ministry. Well, I had heard about Bill Rice Ranch. I had heard John R. Rice preach when I was in college. I had heard Joe B. Rice. I had heard Bill Rice, this man's father, preach many times. I knew about the sword of the Lord. I knew about the Bill Rice Ranch. I knew about some of these, but I didn't know any of these people. He said, Brother Goetsch, as you know, we have a camp, and he said we have some speakers come and preach to the teenagers during our youth weeks. And he said, I'd like to invite you to come and preach one of those youth weeks 2 years from now, 1983. And he gave me a date. I had my calendar, and I opened it, and sure enough, I had that date free. And so I scheduled that meeting over the phone with Dr. Bill. Boy, was I excited. I was ecstatic. I floated back to the trailer. Not because of the opportunity to preach at the ranch, though that was great, but I was going to get to meet Paul Levine. You see, the Bill Rice Ranch started in 1953. Bill and Kathy Rice, their oldest daughter, was deaf. And so they bought 1,500 acres just outside of Murfreesboro, and they established the Bill Rice Ranch primarily for the purpose of deaf people being able to come and hear the gospel in sign language. Well, there weren't enough deaf people to fill every week of the calendar, and so they had family camps and retreats and teen weeks in the summer. And Dr. Paul Levine preached the first teen week in 1953. Well, as the ranch grew, they added more teen weeks until they had 7 teen weeks every summer. And as those weeks multiplied, they asked a second speaker to come to take some of the load of the preaching off of Dr. Levine. And Dr. Bill had asked me to be that second speaker. Wow. I couldn't wait for that meeting to come. And it finally did. Now, I remember the first night walking in a side door to that John R. Rice auditorium. There were 1,400 teenagers sitting there waiting for the service to begin. 1,400 teenagers, not counting the adults, not counting the staff, 1,400 teens. I didn't even look at them. I was thinking, I wonder if I'm going to meet Dr. Paul tonight. I walked a few steps in, and a man came over, and he held out his hand. He said, welcome to the ranch. It was Dr. Bill Rice III. We still hadn't met. He welcomed me to the ranch, and he said, Brother Goetsch, let's go up on the platform. I want you to meet Dr. Paul. Well, I looked up on the platform. There was nothing on the platform. It was very high, 8 steps up. It was a huge platform where they would stand the choir. But the only other thing on the platform was the pulpit and a piano over to the right of the pulpit. There was one bench, a pew, that went all the way across the back of that platform. It was about 30 feet long. And the only person on that platform in that moment was a man sitting on the end of that pew. It was Paul Levine. He had his Bible open and a steno notebook hanging out of it, and he was writing notes. And I thought, that's him. I'd seen a picture of him. I said, that's him. And I'm walking up these stairs to meet him. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, he's preparing his sermon. He's getting ready to preach. I don't want to bother him. But we got up to the top of that stairs, and Dr. Bill said, Brother Paul, this is Dr. Goetsch. Paul Levine closed that Bible, that notebook. He stood up, and he grabbed my hand with both of his. And he said, Brother Goetsch, I'm so honored to meet you. He said, I can't wait to hear you preach. I thought, hear me preach? I'm here to hear you preach. He said, sit by me. Sit by me. Whoa. I sat down in that pew. He sat right there, and he opened that Bible and that notebook, and he continued to write his sermon for the night. I tried to read it. I couldn't read his handwriting. The service started. Dr. Jim Stoltenberg got those young people singing, and it was great. Dr. Paul, the whole time, he's writing notes. And finally, it came time for the introduction of the speaker, and Dr. Bill got up and he said, all right, young people, tonight we get to hear Dr. Paul Levine. Dr. Levine has been preaching here since 1953, preached every youth week, every summer since 1953. Hundreds and hundreds of teenagers have heard this man that you're going to hear tonight preach the Bible. He said, Dr. Paul, how many times have you preached here at the Bill Rice Ranch? How many sermons have you preached? Dr. Paul, he wasn't even listening. He's still writing notes. But he heard his name and his head popped up, and he said, 1,113. And Dr. Bill said, think of that, young people, 1,113 times this man has preached the Bible as you're going to hear it tonight. And Dr. Paul, he punched me in the ribs and he said, I really don't know how many times I preached. He said, all I know is I ran out of sermons a long time ago. That was Dr. Paul. Humble. I remember a couple years later, we were together again there at the ranch, and the young people were a bit hard. They weren't responding like they normally would. And it was Thursday night. It was Dr. Paul's turn to preach, and I could tell he was burdened. All through the song service, I knew he was praying and just asking God to break that thing open. And finally, during the final special, I reached over, and he always wanted me to sit right next to him. And I reached over, and I just kind of lightly tapped his knee, and I said, Dr. Paul, I'm praying for you. He leaned into me. He said, oh, thanks, Brother Goetsch. He said, you know, people tell me, trust the Lord, trust the Lord. I do, but I don't trust the devil. And it was things like that he said to me over the years, began to form and shape my life and ministry. I don't remember the year now, but I was asked to do a session at a pastor's conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Only had one session. The week went all week, conference, lots of different speakers and preachers. I had one session, afternoon session at 1 o'clock. And everybody was required to come. It was the only session going on. And I did my best to keep those guys awake after lunch and did my session. When I was done, I dismissed them out the back door, and they all went out. And I gathered up my things to go my way. My job was done. I was going to stay for the rest of the week and hear the preaching, but my work was done. And I was coming down off the platform. And while everybody was going out the back door, there was one person coming forward. He was in his 90s now. He was grasping from pew to pew, feeling his way, for he was now legally blind. His body riddled with cancer. His wife already in heaven. He would join her in just 2 weeks. And that Bible was open. And that steno notebook. And he had his pen in hand. It was Dr. Paul. I jumped off that platform. I said, Dr. Paul, I didn't know you were here. I didn't know you were here. So good to see you. You know what he said? He didn't say, how you doing, Brother Goetsch? He didn't say that. He pointed that notebook. I looked at it. He had these huge letters where he'd been trying to write the notes. He was legally blind, huge letters. He said, I missed letter E under point 5. What was letter E under point 5? I said, Dr. Paul, you don't need it. Tears began running down his face. Oh, Brother Goetsch, write it in here. Write it big so I can see it. I want to know God better. I want to know my Bible more. That was Dr. Paul. When God seems absent, come back to the humble place. But there's one more location. It's in verse 8. I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, send me. When God seems absent, we must return to the holy place. We must return to the humble place. And we must return to the harvest place. Because God's always in the harvest. When God seems absent, grab some tracts. Pass them out. He'll meet you there. Because that's what he's all about. Seeking and saving that which is lost. He's all about the harvest. Say not ye, there yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest. I say unto you, lift up your eyes, look on the fields. They're white already to harvest. When God seems absent, call the church. Say, Pastor, who's in the hospital? Who can I go give a visit to? Who's shut in that needs some encouragement? Pastor, who can I minister to? Get back to the harvest place. God will be there. We have the birth of Jesus in the early parts of Matthew and Luke. No doubt your pastors preached some of those passages over the last month or so in the Christmas season. We enjoyed those passages immensely. But then the Bible kind of goes silent on Jesus until he begins his earthly ministry. About 20-some years, 25 years go by. There's nothing. He's born. There's a threat to his life at age 2. We get that. But then there's nothing until suddenly he appears. As John says, behold, the Lamb of God. Except for one time. Do you remember it? How old was he? 12. And his earthly parents, Mary and Joseph, had taken him up to Jerusalem. Remember the story? And they were going up to a feast. And they traveled in a crowd. They probably did so for fellowship, maybe security, maybe just, to make sure they'd be safe. But they traveled in a crowd, in a group. And they go up to Jerusalem. They celebrate the feast. And it was a 3-day journey. So they complete the feast. And now they're on their way home. And they got 1 day's journey with this group of people that they're traveling with. And suddenly they realized, we've lost God. They lost God. Can you imagine the conversation? Mary says, Joseph, where's Jesus? I don't know, Mary. I thought he was with you. Well, Joseph, he's not with me. I was sure he was with you. Well, no, Mary. I saw him with you when we left Jerusalem. When's the last time you saw him? Back in Jerusalem. You haven't seen him for a whole day? Joseph, where is he? They panicked, and they thought he must be back in Jerusalem. So they hurry back. Where did they find him? In the temple. And he's answering the questions of the scholars about the Bible. He's only 12. And he's answering their questions. And Mary approaches. Now, when you read the Bible, you have to provide the emotion. You can't just read words. You got to provide the emotion. Because here's what the words say. Mary approaches Jesus. Son, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. Where hast thou been? Those are the words. I don't think that was the emotion, right? You ever lost your kid at Walmart? Like, son, where were you? Are you okay, son? We thought you were hurt. Oh, you're okay. I mean, there was emotion here. Do you remember what Jesus said? How is it that you sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? You should have known where to look. I'd be in the harvest place. He's always there. He's always in the holy place. He's always in the humble place. He's always in the harvest place. By the way, that girl I broke up with that day, we've been married now 50 years. But see, I wasn't ready for marriage at that point in my life. There was a lot of purging that needed to happen in my life before I would enter into something as sacred as marriage. In those 6 days in that hotel room in Los Angeles, that door never opened. I never went outside. No one came in. I didn't talk to a soul. I didn't eat a bite of food. And I've been in thousands of revivals since that day. But I've never had a greater revival than that week, because it was just me and God in the humble place. See, when I came out of college, I was ready to preach in the stadiums. Lord, bring it on. I got 3 sermons. Let me at them. God said, no. We got to go to the humble place first. And that Monday morning, behind my trailer in St. James, I was having that pity party. A car pulled in the driveway. An old 1954 Ford, old antique car. Behind the wheel was a man affectionately known in those parts as Tiny. He weighed well over 400 pounds. Tiny did not go to the Manor Baptist Church in St. James. He lived 40 miles away. But he and his wife and his 2 little girls had come the Sunday night, the night before, and asked if they could talk to my wife and I. We sat down with this large man and his little wife and girls in the front row of that church Sunday night. He began to weep. He said, Brother Goetsch, this is the closest church to where we live. There's no other church that preaches the Bible in our area. And it's getting hard on us to drive 80 miles to church. Our girls are small. It's hard on our marriage. We don't know what to do. We don't know anything about starting a church, but can you help us? Can you give us some advice? Well, I didn't know much. But my wife and I sat there and we listened and we cried and we prayed with them. He pulled in that parking lot. He saw me. He rolled down his window and he said, Brother Goetsch, do you need any food? Now, who rolls into a church parking lot and asks a question like that? I put down my tools and I walked over to him. I said, Tiny, what are you talking about? He said, do you need any food? I said, sure. He said, get in the car. I got in. We started driving that 40 miles to his house. Along the way, I said, Tiny, what's this about? He said, I work for the Jolly Green Giant. I'm looking at this 400-pound man thinking, what do? Are you the mascot or what? You know. I didn't know it, but St. James is in one of the most fertile valleys of agriculture in all of the United States. There are tens of thousands of acres of vegetable farms, and Del Monte, Jolly Green Giant, they all have processing plants, and Tiny was an executive with Jolly Green Giant. He said, Brother Goetsch, I came out of my house today, got in my garage on my way to work. He said, I got 4 freezers in my garage full of food. We mispackage stuff, we mislabel it, I bring it home, I throw it in those freezers. I stepped into that garage and I thought, I wonder if that preacher's hungry. Now I'm sitting there listening to this and I'm thinking, Lord, this is great. This is amazing. But seriously, God, I'm hungry, but broccoli? Green beans? Lord, couldn't you speak to a beef farmer or somebody? We got to that house. He flipped up that garage door, opened those 4 freezers, and I didn't know it. But Jolly Green Giant made lasagna. They made Swiss steak. He loaded that old 54 Ford up with box after box after box of food. We came back, we had to borrow the pastor's freezer, the church freezer. Our freezer was full. By the end of the week, we were giving away boxed food to anybody that would come and listen to me preach for 20 minutes. You know what God said to me? He said, son, you stay on that front row and minister to people. I can feed you. Does God seem absent tonight? Come back to the holy place. Come back to the humble place. Come back to the harvest place. He hasn't left, but sometimes we move, don't we? And revival is about coming back. Let's bow for prayer.